All right, welcome class to today's Explainer. We're stepping back in time today to unpack a seriously complex and absolutely crucial chapter of history. We're going to put on our historian hats and look at how British policies in the Palestine Mandate between 1936 and 1947 led to an escalating and ultimately unresolvable conflict. We'll be tracing the whole narrative, the root causes, the major events, and the heavy consequences of this turbulent decade. So get your notebooks ready because we've got a lot of ground to cover.
Okay, let's kick things off with a quick bell ringer question just to get those historical gears turning. I want you to think about a time you had to share something really valuable with someone else, and an authority figure, like a parent or a teacher, stepped in and just drew a hard line right down the middle. What actually happens when you try to draw borders to solve a dispute? Does drawing a line on a map magically create peace? Or does it kind of just create two new sides to fight over? Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through today's lesson.
Here is our chronological roadmap for today. 1. The Mandate Dilemma. 2. 1937's Impossible Cake. 3. 1939's Leaky Boat. 4. The escalating violence in 1946. And finally 5. Britain stepping away in 1947.
Keep these dates locked in your memory. History is all about cause and effect, right? And here, we're going to see a really rapid escalation. We're moving from a major uprising in 1936 through some totally failed British policies, to a shocking act of violence in 1946, all the way to Britain literally throwing its hands up and handing the issue to the United Nations in 1947.
Let's dive into Section 1, the Mandate Dilemma.
First up, some key vocabulary for your notes. A mandate. In this context, it was basically the official British authority to govern Palestine right after the First World War. You see, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the war, Britain was granted this mandate to administer the territory. But here's the catch. Governing a region with deeply established communities and incredibly complex overlapping historical claims is practically impossible. Britain wasn't just there to rule. They were supposed to be managing a peaceful transition for this territory.
Well, that mandate authority was violently challenged by what became known as the Arab Revolt, stretching from 1936 to 1939. This was a massive, sustained uprising. It was directed against both British colonial rule and the significant spike in Jewish migration to the region at the time. And what this revolt really exposed to the British authorities was that they were caught squarely between two fiercely competing nationalist aims. Both the Arab and Jewish communities had completely different visions for the future of the exact same piece of land. Which brings us to Section 2, 1937, and what I like to call the impossible cake. So to solve the massive unrest of the Arab Revolt, the British started seriously considering a concept called partition. Definitely write this down. Partition means formally dividing a territory into completely separate, distinct political areas for different groups. The logic was kind of like, hey, if two groups can't agree on how to share the land, we'll just chop it into two separate pieces. The map produced by the Peel Commission in 1937 brilliantly illustrates this attempt to slice the impossible cake. The commission investigated the violence and basically concluded, yeah, this mandate is unmanageable. Notice how they proposed drawing new borders: a specific Jewish state up in the north and along the coast, a larger Arab state down to the south and east, and a mandated zone kept under British control, which very importantly included the holy city of Jerusalem. But think about it, just like trying to slice a single dessert for two hungry people who both deeply believed they were promised the whole thing, partition was incredibly controversial. For some, sure, it offered a pragmatic, if painful, compromise. But for so many others on both sides, it was seen as an absolute threat to their national hopes, their security, and their rights. Because it was rejected by so many people, this specific map never actually became reality. Moving on to Section 3, 1939 and the Leaky Vote.
We're looking at a great primary source here, the cover of the 1939 White Paper. In historical terms, a white paper is just a government policy document. But this specific one marked a massive pivot in British strategy. They were desperately trying to plug the holes of unrest and maintain control of the region just before the Second World War broke out. The crucial thing is what was actually inside this document. Instead of partition, the 1939 White Paper formally proposed moving towards a single, independent Palestine within 10 years. And critically, in an attempt to appease the Arab Revolt, it heavily restricted Jewish immigration into the mandate. The goal was to reduce immediate violence. But remember our metaphor, plugging one hole in a leaky boat just caused the water to violently burst through another.
Because here's where the global historical context is absolutely vital.
By restricting immigration in 1939, Britain enacted a policy that the Jewish community universally condemned. Why? Because this was the exact moment when Jewish persecution in Europe under Nazi Germany was tragically and horrifically intensifying. Jewish refugees were desperate to flee Europe, and Britain's policy change essentially slammed the door shut. This created massive new waves of anger and uncertainty toward British rule.
This takes us to Section 4, 1946, Violence Escalates.
A truly shocking, tragic consequence of these failing policies happened in July 1946, when the King David Hotel in Jerusalem was bombed. This wasn't just a hotel. It was actually housing the central offices of the British Mandatory Authorities. Carried out by a militant Zionist group, this devastating attack marked a dramatic spike in paramilitary violence. It proved that the conflict had moved way beyond civil unrest. These were deadly, organized strikes against the British government itself.
So, as you can see, there was this stark, massive disconnect between what Britain wanted and the grim reality on the ground. Britain desperately wanted to maintain control, establish order, and just force some kind of acceptable political compromise. But the actual reality? It was defined by rising paramilitary violence, total unrest, and deepening bitter divisions over migration. The whole situation had just become completely unmanageable for the British Empire. Let's pause right here for a quick check-in. I want you to actively recall what we've covered today. Based on our timeline, from the Arab Revolt to the impossible cake of partition, the leaky boat of the white paper, and the bombing of the King David Hotel, why was it becoming practically impossible for Britain to maintain control? Try to think of your top 3 reasons. All right, get those mental red pens ready. Let's check your answers. You should have noted that Britain struggled immensely because of those fiercely competing nationalist aims, literally 2 groups wanting the same land. You definitely should have mentioned the intense, rising paramilitary violence, plus the intractable disagreements over migration, and of course the universal, growing opposition to British rule from all sides. If you got even a couple of those, excellent job. And that brings us to Section 5, 1947, Britain steps away. Exhausted, unable to find a working solution, bleeding resources, and facing constant attacks, Britain opted for withdrawal. They formally decided to just step away from the mandate entirely. They finally realized that no British policy was ever going to resolve those competing nationalist aims. They literally packed up their files and handed the whole problem over to the international community, specifically the newly formed United Nations. And what did the UN do? Well, in 1947, they looked at the situation and proposed yet another partition scheme, drawing new lines on a map to create a Jewish state and an Arab state, echoing that ghost of the Peel Commission from 10 years earlier. And that brings us to the end of our timeline today, but definitely not the end of the history. I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on as you review your notes. When a powerful empire suddenly packs up and leaves an unresolved conflict behind, without any agreement in place that both sides accept, what do you think happens to the people left standing on the map? That's a huge question, and it's one that history continues to answer to this day. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Make sure you keep your notes organized and keep questioning the past.